Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn 2. There is many talking points about this fight as there were after the first one, probably more. I want to start off with just Eubank Jr. though. Eubank Jr., when Michael Buffer was reading the announcements, Eubank Jr. positioned himself right next to Michael Buffer so he could get in camera and he could get in shot, as someone with an ego that big does. Then when the camera cut to the corner for Chris's introduction, he then joined Chris. When you looked at Nigel, Nigel was with Conor the whole time. And then it was noticeable for me that in the post-fight press conference, Senior wasn't there. So he was there in every press conference. He was there at every opportunity with Chris in the build-up. But when he lost, he was nowhere to be seen at the press conference. Even Ben Shalom was there. It was notable that when Eubank Jr. talked about the hell he'd gone through to even make this fight, and we're still unsure as to what that means, whether he just means the camp, the weight, an injury, whatever. I tend to think there was something in that and not just a ruse by Junior, because as Junior left the press conference, Junior had left the stage and was in the wings. And Ben Shalom started with, Junior's not going to talk about the problem, but I was there in camp. I saw, and Junior shouted from the wings, "Shut up, Ben. Shut up, Ben." With that, though, I didn't like the way that, because Eubank was quite gracious at the end, albeit getting in his disclaimer first. He said, "I've been through hell this week just to even get here, but not to take away from what Conor's done." Well, you just have taken away from what Conor's done by saying that. So, even being gracious in defeat, he can't be that gracious. He has to get in there, "Well, I've been through hell, but I'm not taking enough away from Conor." Yeah, you are. You just have. Other than that, what he said afterwards was quite gracious, and respect to him for that. But, he still threw the caveat in there first. Let's cut to the fight. This is going to be much talked about over the next, foreseeable future. First off, I think this fight, not to take away credit from what Conor Benn done, and we'll go to Conor Benn as part in this next, but let's talk about Eubank Jr. I think two major areas where Chris Jr. lost this fight. Chris Jr. lost this fight in the first fight. He lost the return fight in the first fight, and he also lost it in the camp to the second fight. He gave so much in the first fight. I don't think he could ever I don't think he could ever recreate that effort again. When Conor Benn said he took his soul in the first fight, a certain element of that is true. He took everything out of Chris Eubank, and Chris Eubank had to take everything out of himself to come out victorious in the way that he did in that first fight. So there is an element of truth to that. But one of the other areas is the camp. Now, in the first fight, Eubank Jr., in the Suns sort of build-up show to this, where there was Carl Froch, George Groves, Eubank Sr., and Harlem Eubank. Harlem said in the first fight that he cut corners in training camp. That's essentially why he missed the weight, and that's why he was trying as hard to no doubt shift a ton of weight in the last few days. Now, when people say Eubank's made the weight more comfortably for this fight, I'm going to let you into some, in terms of getting on the scales and being within inside the weight limit, yes, that's what people say, he made the weight more comfortably. No, he just hit the figure. He was inside the figure. That isn't making the weight more comfortably. He's done this camp in the traditional correct sense, which means he's take the weight off, he's trained harder, he's got the weight off at a slower rate. It looks like, he's been more comfortable, as in by the time he gets on the scales, the weight is off. But what that equates to is this. When he cut corners in the first camp, he shifted a ton of weight in the last few days, at the last minute, if you like, and failed to get inside it. When you do the weight properly, when mountaineers, when they climb Everest, when they get within the death zone, where the oxygen is very much depleted to the point of being gone, you can only spend so much time in the death zone. So they have to summit quick and back down quick, because they can only spend so much time in the death zone. With this training camp, with the first training camp, now, if you're a fighter and you're young, it's dangerous to take a shit ton of weight off in the last few days. I think Nassim Hamid took like 14 pounds off in a day or something like that. But when you're young, you can get away with it. You don't pay the price essentially when you're young, or you get away with it. As you get older, as Eubank has, it becomes more dangerous. But what also becomes dangerous is making the weight properly in camps. Because when you cut corners and you get that last bit of weight off, the hard bit of weight, the bottom of the weight, when you get that off over a couple of days, you're spending less time in the death zone. All right, you're spending less time in that depleted area. You're not training, doing them hard miles, the hard spars, the hard sessions on the bike. You're not doing as many of them in the death zone at the bottom of the weight, because you're getting that bottom of the weight off in a shorter period of time. When you do the camp properly, when you get toward those last 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 pounds, and then the points within the pound, you're spending longer down there. You're spending longer in the death zone. You're spending longer in the depleted area, but you're still doing the training. You're still doing last minute sparring. You're still doing last minute training, and you're spending longer doing that in the depleted area, the lower weight, the death zone. So this camp he's done properly. And when you're a young, fit young man, that's not too bad. But when depletion is the enemy, when spending the time in that dehydrated, depleted area, the amount of time you spend in that area, that becomes bad. That becomes bad also. And in this case, it looked like worse, because Eubank Jr. was a lot worse this time than he was in the first fight. The first fight, he finished strong, very strong, stronger than Conor, who wasn't depleted. But this time, he's done the weight properly, and it's cost him, because he spent longer in the death zone, longer in the depleted zone, and it's harmed him way more. This is a bad thing to admit, but this is just truth. He should have done the weight like he did last time. He should have cut corners. It would have left him with more. It would have cost him. He would have paid the price financially, but he would have been a better fighter going into the ring as he was the first time. That's my opinion, and the proof was there to see. Coming to the fight, for the first, as usual, I was watching this, and there was myself, Dean, there was Bob from Canada's Boxing Channel, and Joe Stunner. And I said, after a couple of rounds, I said, Eubank Jr. to me is obviously saving himself for the deep water. He's saving himself for later. He's going to try and come on later at the end of the fight. As Conor weakens, he's going to try and come on later. That was what I thought. And I thought this up to about 3 or 4. But by round 4, I'm thinking, rounds are starting to run away now, and he's starting to give himself a big deficit to make up. So I started to think this is a little bit strange now. He's not been as active, because he's just not doing enough, and rounds are running away. Then when they came in close and Junior's head went down, the ease of which Conor Benn once sort of bundled him over, and then without a lot of force sort of implied one of the other times, Eubank went down really easy. His legs were just gone. No strength in his legs at all. He could barely keep himself up, and he was just going to the ground easy. And I remarked to the lads on the group, I said, look how easy Conor Benn's getting him to the floor. Look how easy Eubank is going to his knees. So that was an indication. Now, a lot of people have said he was shot and he couldn't get, he was thinking about getting his shots off and he couldn't get them off. I disagree. There was about 4 or 5 exchanges where Eubank, I think the reason why Eubank wasn't getting shots off is not because of the way a shot fighter doesn't get his shots off. Okay? A shot fighter does that. The reflexes are gone. The muscle-mind connection is not what it was, and they think about the shot. Opportunity's gone. By the time they thought about it, opportunity's gone. Shot never gets thrown. In this, there are 4 or 5 exchanges where Eubank Jr. did fire back, and he fired back with quick, sharp, accurate punches that actually landed on Benn. And in a couple of those exchanges, he got the better of those exchanges. He made the cognitive decision to fire back, and he was accurate, he was quick, he was sharp, and they landed. But he only opted to do it 4 or 5 times throughout the fight. The rest of the time, he just elected to not throw. It wasn't that he couldn't throw; he elected not to throw. Now, was that because he knew how depleted he was, and he knew he couldn't get into a fight? He knew he couldn't spark Conor Benn into a fight, or he didn't want to, because he knew if he did, he knew if he turned this into a dogfight, he would lose because he didn't have it in him. So he was making the conscious decision not to throw a lot. He fired quick 1-2-3s, 1-2-3-4s, and that was it. And then he stepped off again. Yes, he was depleted, but there wasn't many rounds where he looked from a cardiovascular point of view like he was gasping for air. There was a bit at the end, but on the whole, he didn't look from a cardiovascular side tired. And that would be the reason why he didn't throw his shots. And he didn't throw the shots for me because he was shot and couldn't get them off. Because in the 3 or 4 occasions when he did choose to get them off, he got them off. He did get them off. And as I said, they were quick, they were sharp, and they were landing, and they were scoring. So he did have the ability. He opted not to do it. He opted not to do it because he knew he couldn't do it more than 3 or 4 times in the fight. All that being said, Conor Benn still had to do it and get things right. And in equal parts, I think Conor Benn was good as equally as much as Eubank was bad. I remarked to the lads in the group, you hadn't seen Eubank throw the uppercut. Conor Benn made quite a lot of subtle changes. One of the subtle changes was, in the first fight, he was very square a lot of the time, Conor Benn was. He had used his feet better in this fight. His stance was still a little bit too wide for me, but he did move in with his feet, so he was in range of punching distance. There were still a few occasions where he fell right over the front foot, left himself there, left himself immobile because all his weight had gone forward. But he didn't do it as much, and he did bring his feet in. One of the reasons why I think Eubank didn't really throw the uppercut was Conor Benn had adjusted his hand position for a lot of this fight. Conor Benn, if you go back, he'd got a lot more side on, and he was in this sort of stance. And so his body was turned, and he had his glove forearm and elbow really blocking the route for the uppercut. And he didn't do that the first time. That was a change which he made. And even in the 3 or 4 or 5 salvos that Eubank had, they were jab, right hand, left hook. They weren't the uppercut because Ben had cut off the route to the uppercut a lot of the time when he was in range, which was a really good little technical difference that he made. Ben was good. He stuck to the strategy. I remember Dean and Joe Stanner remarked in the group that there were times where they just felt Ben was like on the edge of fucking losing it and going into all-out war mode, but he didn't. He held it down, and he did stay disciplined. His jab was good. His jab was sharp. His jab was going high. It was going low, and he was out jabbing the bigger, taller, longer guy, and that was really well. He'd jab and he'd get out, and it was all good stuff by Ben. When people say that Eubank was shot, no. If you want to experience, and this goes back to sort of the madness of crowds and how a fighter who's hated can be given a different narrative. When you go back against a fighter that was loved, if you go back to Deontay Wilder against Joseph Parker, now that was a shot fighter. Deontay Wilder didn't let his hands go, couldn't let his hands go. That's the difference between a shot fighter and a fighter electing not to let his hands go. Wilder couldn't and didn't. Eubank elected to not do it very often, but elected to do it in sparse occasions. But he could do it when he did it. Deontay Wilder couldn't. And this is the other thing. And this was my opinion. My opinion was if Joseph Parker's went over Deontay Wilder, he didn't have to do anything. There was no genius game plan. There was none needed. Deontay Wilder didn't throw a punch. Other people said, Andy Lee had done a great job with the tactics to nullify Deontay Wilder. No, Deontay Wilder nullified himself. So, but if you're gonna throw that at Joseph Parker and say how good he was, and you have to give some credit also to Conor Benn and say the same thing. Difference being, Deontay Wilder was shot in the traditional sense. I don't think Eubank was. Eubank was severely hampered by making weight at this point, and I think in the first fight, as I said, he should have cut corners. If he'd have cut corners, he'd have come in healthier and probably stronger and had more in the tank. And that goes against boxing logic and that goes against safety. But the first fight, he cut corners. Look at the performance. The second fight, he done it properly, spent longer in the death zone, and it's killed him. So I don't think we should take too much credit away from Conor Benn. Yes, Conor Benn is still super raw. You've got to remember, before the Eubank fights, he was still prospect level. World titles were talked about in a year or two. And I think we should go back. I think Conor should go back to, development a bit. He's got time. He's got money. People saying that Conor Benn can't make 147 again. Weight's a funny thing. When Crawford moved up to box Canelo, and I'm going to use Canelo and Crawford for two examples here of two things. When Crawford went up to box Canelo, went up 2 weight divisions, I said prior, when a lot of people were saying he was too small, I said it wouldn't bother Crawford that much because Crawford is killing himself to make, was he welter or like welter or super welter? But he was, if you'd seen Crawford in between fights, Crawford was big. He was naturally quite thick. So when he went up to 168, he almost looked bigger than Canelo. You know, in some areas, they're different anatomically, but Crawford didn't. Crawford was comfortable at 168. Conor Benn, although he filled out, Conor Benn had some fluff. There was fluid there. A lot of that was fluid. Conor Benn was small. Conor Benn is still naturally small. He wasn't a big welterweight. I think Conor Benn, given enough time, get the weight off in a sensible fashion over a sensible amount of time, I think Conor can make 147. Conor Benn is not a big guy. He's not a thick guy. He's quite a thin guy. Crawford is a big dude, and I said that for a long time in many videos you can go back and watch. So I think Conor Benn can get down at 147. I think he can and compete. Looking at Eubank can't go anywhere from here for me. You know, and I'm never one of these people that say, I think he should retire. But my thoughts and opinions are, I don't see where he can go. Eubank's problem has always been he's been at the top of middleweight and the bottom of super middleweight. And this is why he stayed at middleweight so long, because he wasn't big enough or thick enough to compete with a big 168ers. And this is why, and because he stayed at middleweight, you've ended up with this shell, this ghost, this carcass of a destroyed physical specimen. Whereas if you look at Canelo's not a big 168. Yeah, he's fought higher than that, but he's not a big 168. Canelo doesn't have to kill himself. And yes, Canelo is very much become one-dimensional. He doesn't throw combinations anymore. He just walks forward and he plods and he doesn't head move. We know all of that. But in terms of making the weight, Canelo does it quite comfortably because Canelo is being good enough, been elite enough to box in a weight division that he makes comfortably. Eubank hasn't. And Eubank isn't good enough or thick enough or strong enough to compete at 168. Hence, he's killed himself making 160, and this is where he's at now. So, in essence, Eubank's, and I don't know actually, was this a 2-fight deal? So there are probably large financial implications if Eubank didn't do the second one. As we know, he already postponed it, and luckily he did because it could have been a lot worse. As it was, the shot in the end, kind of, a lot of people said it's on the tell, no, it scuffed the top of the ear to the back of the head, and it was almost inside of the glove. But even that, you get a big whack behind the ear, especially when you're vulnerable. That's going to be enough to put you over, as it was. And this is just me, but on the night, I kind of thought there was a bit of karma almost for the way that some of the stuff Eubank said and the way he behaved. But looking at it afterwards, I thought about it, and the lads on the group said it the next day that I felt a bit sorry for Eubank seeing him like that, and I did, if I'm honest. And I'm not the biggest Eubank fan, but I did feel for Eubank, and I did feel sorry for him a bit, and it was a shame. I'm like, look, I'm a bit weird. I can dislike stuff that people do on parts about their personality, but it's kind of from an objective point of view. Like I don't hold it against them, so I don't want to see any bad. I don't want to see I didn't want to see Eubank embarrassed, and sort of look like he's lost a bit of dignity in there, and it did, and it wasn't nice to see Eubank like that. And I hope he's all good, and I hope he goes and enjoys time with his family because I wouldn't like to see him carry on. And I wish him well. It was a shame. I didn't, I'd have rather him finish the fight in the same, I wanted Conor to win. I'm not going to hide that. But I would have rather have seen Eubank go out fighting and sort of in a good way rather than like that. I didn't like to see Eubank like that. But you pays your money, you takes your choice, don't you? So yeah, that was it. Not the barnstormer that the first one was, but I did find it compelling. I said to the lads on the group, I said, this isn't the fight we sort of really expected, but on the night watching it live, I found it compelling because before it became evident that Eubank was choosing not to throw because he was so conscious of how depleted he was. You thought, is he just buying time? Is he waiting? Is he waiting? Is he waiting? And he didn't quite know what was coming early in the fight. And for me, that made it a good fight. So, yeah. Anyway, I'll see you all soon.